The strongest men never beg, unless the thing they fear losing cannot be replaced. The rain drummed softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Han estate, blurring the lights of downtown Chicago into streaks of silver and gold. Inside the mansion, where silence was usually more intimidating than raised voices, every servant had stopped moving. Crystal glasses remained untouched on polished tables. Conversations died before they could become whispers. Even the grandfather clock in the entrance hall seemed louder than usual as every pair of eyes turned toward the grand staircase. At the bottom stood Ava Brooks, 24 years old, a quiet black housemaid whose gray housekeeping uniform blended so perfectly into the luxurious surroundings that most people forgot she existed. She held a folded linen towel against her chest, confused by the unexpected message that had summoned her upstairs after midnight. She had never been called to the private wing before. In 7 months of working inside the estate, she had followed every rule without exception. Never ask questions. Never linger near closed doors. Never speak unless spoken to. Most importantly, never disturb Nathan Carter, the man whose name carried enough influence to silence boardrooms, reshape fortunes, and make even confident executives choose their words carefully. To the outside world, Nathan Carter was a respected Korean-American businessman whose immaculate suits, measured smile, and disciplined composure represented success. Rumors surrounded him, as they always did powerful men, but no rumor ever explained why his mansion felt more like a museum than a home. Ava knew almost nothing about him. She preferred it that way. Invisible people survive longer by noticing everything while pretending to notice nothing. A soft click echoed above as the study door opened. Nathan stepped into the hallway alone. He wore no jacket, only a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, as though the weight of the evening had stripped away every unnecessary layer except dignity itself. For the first time since Ava had arrived at the estate, he looked exhausted instead of untouchable. The employees lowered their eyes immediately. No one expected what happened next. Nathan descended each marble step with slow precision until only a few feet separated him from the young maid who still couldn't understand why everyone was staring at her. His dark eyes met hers without anger, without command, and without the cold certainty she had always associated with him. They held something infinitely more unsettling: vulnerability. Ava instinctively took half a step backward. She wondered if she had broken a rule she didn't know existed. Before she could speak, Nathan inhaled quietly, as though gathering the courage to say words he had never imagined saying to anyone. His voice, usually calm enough to stop arguments before they began, barely rose above the sound of the rain. Just one night, please. The words hung in the air so long that nobody seemed capable of breathing. Several staff members exchanged stunned glances before immediately looking away again. One of the older housekeepers covered her mouth in disbelief. A security supervisor standing near the entrance froze with his hand still resting on the radio clipped to his belt. Ava felt the towel slipping from her trembling fingers. Her heart raced, not because of fear, but because nothing about this moment made sense. Why would a man who commanded absolute respect ask anything of someone like her? Why would he say please? Nathan never looked away. There was no arrogance in his expression, no hidden smile, no sign of manipulation. Only the quiet desperation of someone carrying a burden too heavy to describe aloud. Ava searched his face for an answer and found none. She had entered the mansion believing powerful people possessed everything they could ever want. Yet standing before her now was a man who seemed to have everything except the one thing he truly needed. And in that impossible silence, while rain continued tracing lonely paths down the glass walls of the estate, the invisible maid realized that the most extraordinary night of her life had already begun before she had spoken a single word. 7 months earlier, Ava Brooks stepped off the city bus carrying everything she owned inside one faded blue duffel bag that had survived college, 3 apartments, and more difficult seasons than she cared to remember. Chicago greeted her with a cold October wind that slipped beneath her light jacket, but she tightened her grip on the bag instead of complaining. She had promised herself years ago that gratitude would always be louder than disappointment. The address in her hand belonged to the Han estate, a property so large it occupied nearly an entire block on the northern edge of the city. The iron gates opened slowly after the security officer verified her identification 3 separate times. Every detail reminded her that this place operated under rules different from the rest of the world. Long stone pathways curved through perfectly trimmed gardens. Water shimmered quietly across a reflecting pool larger than the playground where she had spent most of her childhood. The mansion itself rose behind rows of maple trees, its limestone walls glowing beneath the morning sun like something preserved from another century. Ava had cleaned offices, hotels, and private homes before, but nothing prepared her for a residence where every hallway looked like an art gallery. She followed the head housekeeper, Mrs. Evelyn Foster, through polished corridors that reflected every step. Mrs. Foster spoke calmly, yet every sentence carried the weight of absolute expectation. Confidentiality was not optional. Curiosity was unacceptable. Every employee respected schedules down to the minute. Every object had a designated place. Every action reflected on the reputation of the household. Ava listened without interrupting. She did not ask about the owner. She did not ask why security cameras overlooked nearly every entrance. She only nodded and memorized each instruction. Before lunch, Mrs. Foster stopped outside a wide staircase leading toward the private residential level. Her expression grew noticeably more serious. "You will never go upstairs unless someone specifically instructs you to do so. Mr. Nathan Carter values privacy above everything else." Ava answered with a simple, "Yes, ma'am." She had learned long ago that people often revealed more when they believed you were not trying to discover anything. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly as she dusted bookshelves, folded fresh towels, and polished antique furniture whose value probably exceeded her lifetime savings. Every room carried a feeling she could not explain. The house was beautiful, yet strangely empty, as though laughter had once lived there and quietly moved away. Around 4 o'clock, she heard measured footsteps crossing the second-floor balcony above the entrance hall. Without thinking, she looked up for only a second. A tall man in a charcoal suit walked across the corridor carrying a leather portfolio beneath one arm. He never looked toward the employees below. His posture remained perfectly straight, his pace steady, his expression unreadable. Within seconds, he disappeared behind another hallway, leaving nothing except silence behind him. "Eyes down," whispered one of the senior maids beside her, gently nudging Ava's elbow. Ava immediately lowered her gaze. "I am sorry." The older woman smiled kindly. "You are new. You did not know." That evening, after finishing her shift, Ava sat alone in the small staff apartment above the detached garage. The room contained a narrow bed, a desk, a bookshelf, and one window overlooking the gardens. It was modest, but clean, peaceful, and more comfortable than anywhere she had lived in years. She unpacked a framed photograph of herself with her late mother, placed it carefully beside the lamp, and quietly thanked God for another chance to begin again. She had no idea that somewhere inside the main house, Nathan Carter had already asked Mrs. Foster for the name of the new maid, who apologized before anyone demanded it, smiled even when nobody noticed, and treated every room with the same care she would have given her own home. He did not request a meeting. He did not ask for a background report. He simply remembered her name. Although Ava Brooks would spend the next 7 months believing the owner of the estate had never truly seen her at all, Ava Brooks quickly discovered that the Hahn estate followed the same rhythm every single day. Breakfast preparations began at 6 o'clock sharp. Fresh flowers arrived every Tuesday and Friday morning. The library was dusted every Wednesday. Silver was polished every Saturday. Predictability made the enormous mansion easier to manage, and Ava appreciated routines because they left little room for mistakes. Within weeks, she became known among the household staff as the employee who never complained, never arrived late, and somehow noticed problems before anyone asked her to solve them. If a vase leaned slightly to one side, she straightened it. If a guest accidentally left behind a scarf, she carefully folded it before anyone noticed it was missing. If one of the kitchen assistants looked overwhelmed before a large dinner party, Ava quietly finished her own assignments early and offered help without expecting recognition. Most days, no one thanked her. She did not mind. Her mother had often told her that character was measured by what people did when nobody was watching. What Ava did not know was that someone was watching far more often than she could imagine. Nathan Carter rarely spent long hours inside the mansion, But every evening before leaving for another meeting or returning from one, he reviewed the daily reports prepared by Mrs. Evelyn Foster. The reports were never about luxury or expenses. Nathan believed successful households depended upon reliable people, not expensive furniture. Whenever an employee solved a problem, treated a guest with unusual kindness, or demonstrated remarkable consistency, Mrs. Foster documented it. Over time, one name appeared again and again. Ava Brooks. She reorganized the storage room without being asked. Ava Brooks. She stayed 30 minutes after her shift ended to help prepare the ballroom because another employee had become ill. Ava Brooks. She found an elderly delivery driver struggling to carry heavy boxes and quietly helped him unload every package before returning to work. Nathan never commented aloud, yet each report lingered in his thoughts longer than the others. One rainy afternoon, he happened to look through the security monitors while waiting for an important video conference to begin. Most executives use surveillance to monitor property. Nathan watched people. On one screen he noticed Ava kneeling beside the estate gardener, an older man whose arthritic hands made tying young rose bushes unusually difficult. She smiled as she finished securing the supports while the gardener laughed at something she quietly said. There were no cameras close enough to capture the conversation, but Nathan noticed something far more valuable than words. She expected nothing in return. When she finished helping, she simply brushed dirt from her gloves, returned the tools, and continued toward the laundry room as though the moment had never happened. Nathan found himself delaying the conference for another minute just to watch her disappear around the corner. It confused him more than he cared to admit. He had spent years surrounding himself with talented professionals, ambitious executives, and influential partners, yet genuine kindness always seemed so rare that it almost looked unfamiliar. Meanwhile, Ava continued believing she remained invisible inside the mansion. On the rare occasions Nathan crossed her path, he acknowledged her with nothing more than a polite nod before continuing down another hallway. He never stopped to speak. He never gave personal instructions. To Ava, he was simply an exceptionally disciplined employer who valued order above conversation. She assumed he probably did not even remember her name. During one quiet evening, while replacing fresh towels in the guest suites, Ava paused beside a framed family photograph displayed near the upstairs hallway. It showed a much younger Nathan standing beside an elegant older couple and a smiling teenage girl whose bright expression seemed to fill the picture with warmth. Before Ava could study it any longer, Mrs. Foster gently called her from the end of the corridor. "We should keep moving." Ava immediately apologized and continued working, never realizing Nathan had quietly witnessed the entire moment from the partially open door of his study. He noticed that she had not reached for the frame, had not asked questions, and had not lingered out of curiosity. She simply looked at the photograph with quiet respect before walking away. As he watched her disappear once again into the endless hallways of the estate, Nathan experienced a feeling he had almost forgotten. For the first time in many years, someone inside his home made the mansion feel just a little less empty without ever trying to change it. A week before Thanksgiving, the first snow of the season settled quietly across the gardens surrounding the Hahn estate, covering stone pathways and bare maple branches with a thin blanket of white that softened everything except the silence inside the mansion. Ava Brooks stood near the kitchen window before sunrise, wrapping both hands around a mug of hot tea while watching the grounds disappear beneath drifting snowflakes. Winter had always reminded her of home, not because life had been easy, but because her mother believed every difficult season eventually gave way to spring. Before leaving for work each morning, her mother would smile and say, "Do not let cold weather convince you the sun has forgotten you." Those words stayed with Ava long after cancer had taken away the only family she had left. She rarely spoke about that chapter of her life. Grief had taught her that some stories became quieter instead of shorter. The framed photograph beside her bed remained the only evidence that another life had once existed before she arrived at the Hahn estate. Every Sunday evening, she placed fresh flowers beside the picture, whispered a brief prayer, and promised herself she would continue living with the kindness her mother had spent 23 years teaching her. Across the mansion, Nathan Carter occupied a study large enough to overlook the frozen gardens through walls of glass. Financial reports covered his desk, but his attention rested on an entirely different object. The family photograph Ava had quietly paused to observe days earlier now sat in his hands. The smiling teenage girl standing beside him had been his younger sister, Hannah. She possessed an impossible ability to fill every room with laughter no matter how difficult the day became. Years earlier, she had convinced Nathan that success meant very little if it could not make someone else's burden lighter. After she passed away following a long illness, the mansion changed forever. Conversations became shorter. Celebrations quietly disappeared from the calendar. The grand piano in the music room had not been opened in years because nobody remained willing to play the songs Hannah loved most. Nathan often told himself that work was easier than remembering. Building companies required discipline. Facing an empty home required courage he had never fully recovered. Mrs. Evelyn Foster knocked gently before entering with the weekly household report. Nathan signed several documents before asking an unexpected question. "Does Miss Brooks ever take personal leave?" Mrs. Foster looked surprised. "Very rarely, sir. She usually volunteers to cover holidays so other employees may visit their families." Nathan lowered his eyes toward the report again. "Does she have relatives nearby?" Mrs. Foster answered softly. "Not anymore, sir. She has never discussed it in detail, but I believe she is alone." Nathan remained silent after she left. Alone. The single word echoed far longer than he expected. Later that afternoon, Ava carried fresh linens toward the upstairs guest rooms when she heard faint piano music drifting through the hallway. She stopped, uncertain whether she had imagined it. Following the melody only as far as her assigned route allowed, she noticed one of the music room doors standing slightly open. Inside, Nathan sat alone before the grand piano. His movements were careful rather than polished, as though he remembered the melody from someone else's hands instead of his own. Ava quietly lowered her eyes and continued walking without making a sound. She never realized Nathan had already noticed her reflection passing across the polished piano lid. He did not call her name. He simply finished the final notes and allowed the room to return to silence. That evening, while preparing the dining room for another formal dinner, Ava found a single white lily resting inside an empty crystal vase that had not been there earlier that morning. Without thinking, she smiled because lilies had been her mother's favorite flower. She carefully refreshed the water, trimmed the stem, and placed the vase where afternoon sunlight would reach it the next day. She assumed one of the florists had made a mistake with the delivery. Nathan, watching quietly from the second-floor balcony, never corrected that assumption. For reasons he could not fully explain, seeing the young maid smile at something so small made the enormous mansion feel warmer than any roaring fireplace ever had. December settled over Chicago with crisp mornings and long evenings, and the Hahn estate entered its busiest season of the year. Charitable foundations, business partners, and community leaders filled the calendar with holiday receptions that transformed the mansion into a place of elegant gatherings almost every weekend. To the guests, everything appeared effortless. Fresh arrangements decorated every hallway. Candlelight reflected across polished marble floors. Soft music drifted through rooms where conversations carried the confidence of successful lives. Yet behind every flawless evening stood dozens of employees whose work remained invisible. Ava Brooks welcomed that invisibility. She moved quietly from room to room, making certain every guest found a warm cup of coffee before realizing they wanted one, replacing empty serving trays before anyone noticed they were running low, and helping nervous young assistants who were working their first formal event. She never looked for attention because she believed kindness lost something precious the moment it expected applause. During one reception, a catering employee accidentally dropped an entire tray of desserts moments before they were scheduled to be served. The young man looked devastated, convinced his first assignment would also become his last. Before panic could spread through the kitchen, Ava calmly gathered several other staff members, reorganized the remaining desserts onto smaller serving platters, suggested a different presentation, and quietly helped prepare enough replacements to keep the evening running without interruption. Most guests never realized anything had gone wrong. When the event ended, the relieved catering employee thanked her repeatedly. Ava simply smiled and told him everyone deserved a second chance because she had needed many herself. Standing unnoticed on the upstairs balcony, Nathan Carter had witnessed the entire situation from beginning to end. It was not Ava's efficiency that held his attention. It was the way she protected another person's dignity without ever mentioning that she had done so. She could easily have allowed someone else to receive the blame. Instead, she chose compassion over convenience. Later that night, after the final guests departed, Mrs. Evelyn Foster reviewed the evening with Nathan inside his study. She praised the staff for another successful event before adding one final observation. Miss Brooks prevented what could have become a very embarrassing situation. She never asked for recognition. Nathan remained quiet for several moments before responding. Does she always put others first? Mrs. Foster smiled gently. Every single day, sir. Some people work because they need a paycheck. Others work because they believe every task deserves their best effort. She belongs to the second group. Nathan nodded once, but his thoughts remained elsewhere long after the conversation ended. The following afternoon, Ava visited a neighborhood grocery store during her only day off. After purchasing a few simple necessities, she noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach a heavy bag of pet food from the bottom shelf. Without hesitation, Ava helped place it into the woman's shopping cart and carried several bags to her car despite the freezing wind. She declined the woman's offer of money with the same warm smile she offered everyone. As fate would have it, Nathan had stopped at the same shopping center after a meeting nearby. From inside his parked vehicle, he recognized Ava crossing the icy parking lot beside the elderly stranger, laughing softly as though they had known each other for years. She had no idea anyone from the estate was there. She believed no one was watching. Nathan realized that the kindness she showed inside his home was not part of her job. It was simply who she was. That quiet discovery unsettled him more deeply than any business negotiation ever could. He had spent years learning how to evaluate talent, predict ambition, and understand influence. Yet genuine goodness remained something no report, resume, or financial statement could ever measure. As Ava disappeared into the snowy afternoon carrying only her small grocery bag, Nathan stayed inside his car a little longer than necessary, watching until she was completely out of sight. For reasons he still could not explain, the mansion no longer felt like the place where his life truly changed. Somehow, that ordinary grocery store parking lot had shown him something infinitely rarer than success. It had shown him a heart that remained generous even when no reward, no audience, and no recognition waited at the end of the day. The week before Christmas brought a different atmosphere to the Hahn estate. The decorations remained elegant, the fireplaces burned throughout the day, and guests continued arriving in expensive cars, yet something invisible had changed. Nathan Carter had begun canceling dinners, shortening meetings, and spending more evenings inside the mansion than anyone could remember. The employees quietly assumed the end of the year demanded more of his attention, but Mrs. Evelyn Foster noticed something deeper. Nathan no longer lingered over financial reports after sunset. Instead, he often stood beside the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens, staring into the distance as though searching for an answer that could not be found in numbers. One afternoon, a thick snowfall forced several staff members to remain on the property longer than expected. Since the roads had become dangerous, Mrs. Foster invited everyone to share a simple dinner in the employees' dining room before attempting the drive home. Ava happily joined them, laughing softly as one of the younger kitchen assistants unsuccessfully tried to bake homemade cookies from his grandmother's recipe. The cookies emerged from the oven unevenly shaped and slightly overcooked, but everyone accepted one anyway. Ava broke hers in half and handed the larger piece to the embarrassed young man, insisting they tasted better than they looked. The room filled with genuine laughter, the kind that could never be rehearsed. As the evening continued, one of the housekeepers quietly asked Ava whether she planned to visit family for Christmas. A brief silence settled over the table before Ava answered with the same gentle smile she always wore. My mother used to say that home is wherever people choose to care about one another. I miss her every day, but I still celebrate because she would never forgive me for wasting Christmas on sadness. Nobody knew quite how to respond. There was no self-pity in her voice, only gratitude wrapped around quiet loss. Unknown to everyone in the dining room, Nathan had paused outside while walking toward his study after returning from a late meeting. The partially opened door allowed those simple words to reach him with complete clarity. He remained motionless for several seconds before continuing down the hallway without making a sound. That night, he opened a small wooden box stored inside the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside rested dozens of handwritten Christmas cards his younger sister Hannah had given him over the years. Every card carried the same message in different words. Kindness is the only gift that grows after you give it away. Nathan slowly closed the box. For years he had protected his businesses, his reputation, and the people who depended on him. Yet somewhere along the way he had forgotten how to protect his own heart from becoming unbearably empty. The next morning, before sunrise, Ava stepped outside to scatter birdseed near the frozen garden fountain as she often did during winter. She believed the small birds deserved an easier season too. Wrapped in her thick coat and wool gloves, she smiled as tiny sparrows cautiously gathered around the seeds. She never noticed Nathan standing quietly behind the library window with a warm cup of coffee in his hands. He watched the birds land without fear around her feet, as though even they recognized the gentle spirit she carried wherever she went. It struck him that no one had instructed her to feed them. No report would ever mention this simple act. No promotion or bonus depended upon it. She simply believed that if she could make another living creature's day a little easier, then the effort was worthwhile. As Ava walked back toward the staff entrance, brushing snowflakes from her sleeves, Nathan remained where he was. For the first time in many years, the silence inside the mansion no longer reminded him only of what he had lost. It also reminded him of something he had almost forgotten could still be found: hope. He did not yet understand what role Ava Brooks would eventually play in his life, but one truth had become impossible to ignore. Without ever asking for attention, making demands, or expecting recognition, she had quietly begun restoring warmth to a home that had spent years learning how to survive without it. The rain returned on the final evening of the year, falling gently across the glass walls of the Hahn estate with the same quiet rhythm that had filled the mansion months earlier. Most of the staff had finished preparing for the small New Year's gathering and were beginning to leave for the evening. Mrs. Evelyn Foster encouraged everyone to spend the holiday with friends whenever possible, reminding them that the remaining responsibilities could easily be managed by the overnight team. Ava Brooks helped carry the last tray into the kitchen before removing her apron and preparing to return to the small apartment above the garage. As she walked through the main hallway, she noticed that the grand staircase remained unusually dark. The mansion felt peaceful, yet strangely lonely, as though it were waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Upstairs, Nathan Carter stood alone inside his study, staring at the calendar resting beside Hannah's framed photograph. Every year the same date carried the same quiet weight. It was the anniversary of the evening his sister had spent her final New Year's celebration, encouraging him to build a life that valued people more than accomplishments. She had smiled through her own exhaustion, insisting that kindness always outlived success. Since losing her, Nathan had spent every anniversary alone inside the mansion, believing solitude was easier than remembering. Yet this year the silence felt heavier than before. For months, he had watched one woman quietly transform every corner of the estate without realizing she was doing so. She had reminded employees that mistakes deserved patience instead of humiliation. She had treated strangers with the same respect she offered lifelong friends. She had shown compassion when nobody expected it and humility when recognition would have been easy. Somewhere along the way, the enormous house had begun feeling less like a monument to memories and more like a place where hope might still exist. Nathan finally understood why. It was never the marble floors, priceless artwork, or endless success that made a home feel alive. It was the presence of someone who carried light into ordinary moments. Downstairs, Ava paused after noticing a small lamp still glowing beneath the study door. She assumed Nathan was finishing paperwork before midnight and quietly turned to leave, not wishing to disturb him. Before she reached the staircase, Mrs. Foster approached with an apologetic expression. "Miss Brooks, Mr. Carter asked whether you were still on the property. If you have a moment, he would appreciate speaking with you." Ava looked surprised. During 7 months of employment, he had never requested a private conversation. She smoothed the sleeves of her uniform, nodded politely, and walked upstairs with measured steps. When she gently knocked on the study door, Nathan invited her inside. The room looked exactly as she expected: neat bookshelves, a glowing fireplace, and wide windows overlooking the rain. Yet something about Nathan seemed completely different. His shoulders no longer carried their usual certainty. The confident distance that had always surrounded him had quietly disappeared. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Ava wondered whether she had accidentally made a mistake during the evening's preparations. Instead, Nathan slowly walked toward the window before turning back to face her. His voice remained calm, but beneath that calm rested an honesty unlike anything she had ever heard from him. "Tomorrow marks another beginning for everyone," he said quietly. "But tonight reminds me of someone I loved very much." Ava listened without interrupting. Nathan glanced briefly toward the framed photograph resting on his desk. She recognized the smiling young woman immediately. Hannah, the picture she had once seen in the upstairs hallway. She believed no one should face difficult nights alone, he continued. "I spent years ignoring that lesson because I convinced myself that strength meant carrying every burden in silence." He lowered his eyes for a moment before meeting Ava's again. There was no authority left in his expression, no distance, and no expectation that his words would automatically be accepted. There was only quiet sincerity. After taking a slow breath, Nathan spoke the sentence that would forever change both of their lives. "Would you stay in the house tonight?" he asked softly. "Not because you work here. Not because you owe me anything. Simply because I do not want this anniversary to be faced alone anymore." Ava stood completely still, finally understanding that the request carried nothing except trust, grief, and the hope that another human being's presence might make a lonely night feel a little less empty. Ava Brooks did not answer immediately. She looked toward the rain sliding slowly down the tall windows, then back at Nathan Carter, searching his face for anything that suggested hidden expectations or unspoken conditions. She found neither. The man standing before her no longer resembled the distant employer whose quiet presence could command an entire room without raising his voice. He looked like someone carrying years of loneliness with remarkable discipline, until one ordinary evening finally became too heavy to carry alone. Ava spoke gently. "If my staying will bring you peace tonight, then I will stay." Nathan closed his eyes for the briefest moment, almost as though relief had arrived so quietly that he was afraid to acknowledge it. "Thank you," he answered. They left the study together and walked toward the library, where a small fire crackled inside the stone fireplace. The room felt warm without being extravagant, filled with shelves of well-read books instead of decorations meant to impress visitors. Nathan prepared 2 cups of hot tea himself, surprising Ava even further. She instinctively offered to help, but he smiled faintly and shook his head. "Tonight you are not here to work." Those simple words carried more respect than any expensive gift could have expressed. For a while neither of them spoke. They listened to the rain outside and watched the flames move quietly behind the fireplace screen. Eventually Nathan reached for the framed photograph resting on a nearby table and handed it to Ava. "Her name was Hannah," he said softly. "She believed every person deserved to feel seen." Ava studied the smiling young woman in the picture with quiet admiration. "She has kind eyes," she replied. Nathan nodded. She always noticed people everyone else overlooked. The maintenance workers, the receptionists, the elderly neighbors who lived alone. She remembered birthdays that even family members forgot. She used to tell me that success meant very little if it never reached another human heart. His voice remained steady, yet every sentence carried the weight of treasured memories carefully protected through the years. Ava listened without interrupting because she understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was allowing another person enough silence to finish their thoughts. After a few moments, she shared a story of her own. She spoke about her mother working 2 jobs while still finding time to volunteer at a neighborhood food pantry every Saturday morning. She remembered asking as a little girl why they kept giving away food when they barely had enough for themselves. Her mother had smiled and answered, "Because generosity is not measured by how much we own. It is measured by how willing we are to share what we have." Nathan lowered his eyes toward his cup. The 2 women had never met, yet somehow they had spent their lives teaching the same lesson in different places. Hours passed almost unnoticed. They talked about favorite books, childhood dreams, quiet regrets, and the strange way grief never truly disappeared but slowly learned to walk beside hope instead of in front of it. There was no awkwardness to overcome because neither of them felt pressured to become someone different. They simply occupied the same room with honesty neither had experienced in a very long time. Just before midnight, the rain finally stopped. Ava walked toward the window and looked across the gardens where fresh clouds drifted apart, revealing a sky filled with bright winter stars. My mother always believed clear skies arrived after people had cried enough tears, she said with a gentle smile. Nathan joined her beside the window. Hannah used to say almost the same thing. For the first time in years, the approaching new year did not feel like another lonely reminder of what had been lost. Instead, it felt like permission to begin again without forgetting the people who had shaped the journey. As the clock in the entrance hall slowly struck midnight, neither of them celebrated with grand speeches or dramatic promises. They simply stood in peaceful silence, grateful that two lives which had once seemed impossibly different had discovered the quiet comfort of simple human presence. In that stillness, Nathan finally understood that healing rarely arrived through extraordinary moments. Sometimes it entered a home as quietly as one compassionate person who chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. Spring arrived in Chicago almost unnoticed. The snow disappeared from the gardens, the maple trees slowly filled with fresh green leaves, and sunlight once again poured through the tall windows of the Hahn estate. Yet the greatest change had not happened outside. It had happened within the walls of the mansion itself. Employees who had worked there for years quietly remarked that the house somehow sounded different now. The silence was no longer heavy. Music occasionally drifted from the grand piano in the evenings. Fresh flowers appeared throughout the hallways more often than before. Nathan Carter no longer hurried through every meal or disappeared behind the closed door of his study the moment work ended. Instead, he had begun asking the kitchen staff to prepare enough dinner for everyone working late, insisting that no employee should finish a long day hungry. Mrs. Evelyn Foster smiled every time she watched those small changes unfold because she understood something most people overlooked. True leadership did not become visible through power. It became visible through kindness repeated consistently. Ava Brooks never sought credit for any of it. She continued performing the same responsibilities with the same quiet grace that had defined her first day at the estate. She still greeted every employee with genuine warmth, still helped new staff members learn their routines, and still believed that no task became unimportant simply because few people noticed it. The only difference was that now people noticed her. One afternoon, Nathan invited the entire household staff to the main dining room for an announcement. Such gatherings were rare enough that everyone wondered whether another formal event required additional preparation. Instead, Nathan stood before them with the same calm composure they all recognized, although his eyes carried a warmth that had once seemed impossible. He thanked every employee for the dedication they had shown over the years before pausing beside Ava. Looking around the room, he spoke slowly enough that every word settled into complete silence. A home is never built by stone, glass, or wealth. It is built by the people who choose every day to fill it with dignity, patience, and compassion. This house became a home again because someone reminded me of that truth. He turned toward Ava with quiet respect. Miss Brooks, thank you for showing all of us that kindness never needs permission to change a life. No applause followed immediately because the room had become too emotional for anyone to speak. Then one of the senior gardeners began clapping softly. The kitchen staff joined him. The security officers followed. Within moments, every employee in the mansion stood applauding the young woman who had spent months believing she was invisible. Ava lowered her eyes, overwhelmed, and simply whispered, "Thank you." She never imagined that the greatest recognition she would receive would come not for extraordinary achievements, but for ordinary kindness practiced every single day. As the months continued, Nathan established a scholarship in Hannah's memory for students pursuing careers in community service and nursing, explaining that the world always needed more people willing to care for others. He also expanded employee education benefits, believing that opportunity should never depend solely upon someone starting position in life. Whenever journalists praised his generosity, Nathan quietly redirected every compliment toward the people who had inspired him to see success differently. He never mentioned the conversation that had changed everything. That memory remained private, treasured not because it belonged to the past, but because it continued shaping every decision that followed. One warm evening near the beginning of summer, Ava stood beside the restored garden fountain, watching birds gather beneath the setting sun, just as they had during the winter months when she first scattered seeds across the snow. Nathan joined her a few moments later without saying anything. Neither of them needed long conversations anymore to understand one another. They simply watched the golden light settle across the estate that no longer felt lonely. At last Nathan spoke quietly. "Hannah would have liked you very much." Ava smiled gently toward the sky. "I think I would have liked her too." They remained there until the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the trees, surrounded not by grand declarations or dramatic promises, but by the quiet certainty that genuine respect could transform even the loneliest heart. And on that peaceful evening, everyone who called the Han estate home remembered what true dignity looked like.